To swirl around the death of Nolan Wells, the 18-year-old who was found dead after boating with his friends on 4th of July weekend. Wells' parents and their attorney, Ben Crump.
For 18 days, he said nothing. His mother, a sitting Mississippi judge, posted online instead on his behalf, saying only that he had cooperated fully with investigators. Then on July 21st, Warren Hudson sat down in front of a camera for the first time, and the number he used to describe how many people were on Horn Island that day had grown 300, according to early reports, then over 1,000 in his own telling. Then, later in the same interview series, maybe even 4,000 people. Boats all the way around the entire island, he said. Every area of Horn Island is covered, 100%. The crowd kept growing every time he described it. Nolan Wells did not sue. Hit that bell. Warren Hudson is the son of Ashley Cole, a Chancery Court judge in Jackson County, Mississippi. For more than 2 weeks after Nolan's body was found, Judge Cole spoke publicly instead of her son. On July 7th, she posted to Facebook, confirming Warren had traveled to Horn Island with Nolan and offering her own account of what happened. Nolan made a decision to stay on the island, she wrote, and return inland later with another group of friends. She said her son had cooperated fully with law enforcement. She said her family's prayers were with Nolan's family. That first statement was measured, careful, the kind of language a sitting judge would choose deliberately. Acknowledging the tragedy, defending her son in general terms, without wading into specifics that might complicate an active investigation. 2 days later, on July 9th, she posted again, this time describing death threats against her own children, and confirming she had deactivated her social media because of images of her kids circulating online. We have not had the opportunity to speak to the Wells-Wansley family or their attorney, she wrote. However, we are willing to directly communicate with attorney Ben Crump and the Wells-Wansley family. We will provide them with all the information known to us so their family can rest and properly mourn. That offer, direct communication with Crump, full information, an end to public statements filtered through Facebook, did not immediately happen. 12 days passed, no documented meeting between Judge Cole and Crump has been reported publicly in that window. No formal information exchange has been described. Instead, on July 21st, her son went on a podcast. Not a sit-down with the family's attorney, not a formal statement to investigators beyond what he had reportedly already given. A conservative commentator's YouTube show released in installments, building an audience across multiple episodes rather than delivering everything at once. Warren Hudson chose Brandon Tatum, the conservative commentator known as the Officer Tatum. For his first public interview, released July 21st in multiple parts, he described how close he and Nolan had been. They met in 8th grade, he said, eating lunch together weekly, building a friend group he called very tight-knit. He described Horn Island on July 4th as electric, the most popular day of the year to be on that water, boats stretching further than he could count. And he made a claim that has since become the centerpiece of every conversation about this interview. He said he and his friends begged Nolan to leave the island with them, not casually mentioned it, begged. Nancy Grace did not hedge when she addressed this case on her program. Somebody's lying, she said, 2 words, no qualification, no allegedly, no room left for interpretation. A former prosecutor with decades of experience reading conflicting witness accounts looked at everything available. The friend's story, the independent witness who says Nolan intended to head back to the boat, the judge mother's own account, Hudson's own shifting descriptions, and reached a conclusion sharper than almost anyone else covering this case has been willing to state on air. Grace built her career prosecuting cases in Atlanta before becoming one of television's most recognizable crime commentators. Someone whose entire professional identity rests on the ability to read a set of conflicting accounts and identify where the story breaks down. When someone with that background says somebody's lying without qualification, it carries different weight than the same phrase from a commentator without her specific prosecutorial history. Grace's coverage did not go unchallenged. Social media users pushed back on her, questioning why a true crime commentator was digging into the private accounts of teenagers connected to a case still under active investigation. Some critics argued the intense public scrutiny directed at Hudson, Shepard, and the third friend amounted to a kind of trial by media, young men not yet charged with anything, facing the kind of forensic-level public dissection usually reserved for defendants standing before an actual jury. Grace clapped back directly at her critics, defending her decision to keep asking questions about how police were handling the case, arguing, in effect, that a massive platform asking hard questions is exactly what a case like this needs when official answers have been slow to arrive. That exchange itself became its own small story within the larger one, a television host defending her right to keep pressing, while critics questioned whether that pressure was falling disproportionately on teenagers who have not been charged with any crime. Hours after Nolan was laid to rest, Grace was already asking the questions many people online had been shouting for weeks. There is a specific detail from Hudson's interview that therapists and behavioral analysts reviewing the footage online have focused on repeatedly. Not what he said, but how he said it. Multiple reaction videos analyzing Hudson's demeanor, his pauses, his phrasing, the moments where he appeared to search for words, have circulated widely, with commentators describing him as struggling to give details at key points in the conversation. That kind of commentary is opinion, not forensic fact. Body language and hesitation in an interview can reflect grief, trauma, nervousness in front of a camera, or a young man carefully trying not to misstate something in a case where every word is being picked apart, just as easily as it could reflect something else. Warren Hudson did not simply give an interview. He created a moment that an entire ecosystem of online true crime analysts, forensic psychology accounts, and commentary channels immediately treated as raw material. Parsing his sentence structure, his eye contact, his timing, the same way professional negotiators might analyze a hostage tape. Hudson addressed the accusations against him and his friends directly, in a separate interview with the New York Post published around the same time. "It's a sick world we're living in," he said. "It's terrible. Nolan was my best friend." He pushed back on the broader narrative circulating online. "There's no facts out, just a lot of rumors," he said. "That's just how the internet is today. That's really it. It's horrible." That frustration sits alongside something specific his own mother disclosed weeks earlier, that Ashley Cole knew Christine Wansley personally, having graduated from the same high school. Two families with an actual, pre-existing connection, not strangers thrown together by tragedy, but people from the same community, the same schools, the same generation of Mississippi Gulf Coast families, now separated by a case neither side agrees on. Early reporting on this case described roughly 300 people on Horn Island that day. By the time Hudson gave his own account, the number had grown to more than 1,000, later in the same interview series, maybe even 4,000 people, with boats all the way around the entire island. Crowd estimates at informal gatherings are notoriously unreliable. Nobody takes an actual headcount at a holiday party on a barrier island, and honest witnesses can genuinely disagree by a wide margin without anyone lying. An estimate that grows by more than tenfold across a single interview series from the same person describing the same afternoon is a pattern in its own right. Whether that growth reflects Hudson genuinely recalling more detail as the interview progressed, an unconscious tendency to emphasize how crowded, and therefore how unremarkable Nolan's disappearance into that crowd might have seemed, or simply the natural imprecision of estimating anything in a chaotic setting, is not something that can be resolved from the outside. What can be said is that thousands of people, boats covering the entire island, is doing specific narrative work. It reinforces the idea that Nolan being briefly out of sight, even for hours, would not have seemed unusual in a crowd that size. None of what Hudson has said resolves the central contradiction Ben Crump has raised publicly and repeatedly. An independent witness, the young woman friends say Nolan stayed behind to talk to, has, through her sister, given an account suggesting Nolan intended to return to the boat, not remain on the island. Judge Cole's own July 7th statement flatly asserts the opposite, that Nolan made a decision to stay, with plans to return with a different group later. Hudson's begged him to leave claim sits between those two accounts without fully reconciling either one. If the friends begged Nolan to leave and he refused, that is consistent with Judge Cole's version. Nolan choosing to remain against his friend's wishes. It does not on its own address why the independent witness's account describes something different. Ben Crump has not, in any available public statement, responded specifically to Hudson's "I begged him to leave" claim on the record. What Crump has said consistently is that the accounts given by the three friends contain contradictions serious enough to demand a full, transparent investigation. Contradictions involving the phone, the timeline, and now, implicitly, the scale of the gathering itself. A claim this specific that friends pleaded with Nolan and were refused would, if independently corroborated, represent genuine evidence of concern and care on the friend's part. It would also, if it cannot be corroborated beyond Hudson's own account, remain exactly what it currently is. One more detail from one interview: sitting alongside a mother's Facebook statement, a Nancy Grace verdict, and an independent witness's contradicting story, none of which the public can fully verify without access to the same file the eventual grand jury will see. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. His friend broke his silence after 18 days, choosing a podcast over a formal statement. He says he begged Nolan to leave. His mother, a sitting judge, says Nolan chose to stay. An independent witness says Nolan intended to go back. Nancy Grace says somebody is lying. Nobody outside this case can currently say which account that is. What can be said is this: for 18 days, the public heard from a judge speaking carefully on her son's behalf, offering measured Facebook statements and a stated willingness to sit down directly with Ben Crump. That sit-down has not been publicly confirmed to have happened. Instead, the public got a podcast, multiple episodes, a growing crowd estimate, a claim of pleading that has not been independently corroborated, and a level of behavioral scrutiny online that few 18-year-olds have ever faced for simply describing the worst day of their life. Somewhere in that gap, between a judge's cautious Facebook posts and her son's multi-part podcast confessional, between "cooperated fully" and "I begged him to leave," between a crowd that kept growing every time he described it, sits whatever actually happened to Nolan Wells on July 4th. The grand jury will eventually see the file that resolves it. The public, for now, has only the podcast, the Facebook post, and Nancy Grace's 2 words. If you have any real information about what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island, contact investigators directly, tips.fbi.gov or 1-800-CALL-FBI. The combined reward is now $125,000. Hit that bell. 18 days of silence, then a podcast, not a police statement. "I begged him to leave," he said. The crowd he described grew larger every time he told the story. Nolan never got the chance to tell his.